count you down, so you do know.
He's a real nice dog.
Speak.
Well, I don't really know if I should address you as Sergeant or Mr. or how would you like to be addressed?
Lee is fine.
Lee,
Yeah,
okay.
right.
Lee, I'm Bobbie. It's nice to have this chance to talk with you because when I saw the movie, I really didn't know anything about your background. And when I came out of that movie, I said that man has to have been or had some connection with the Marine Corps and drill instructors because he's just too real. And then I find that you really were a drill instructor. So tell me just a little bit about your Marine background.
Well, I was, in fact, a drill instructor in 1965, 66, and 67 era. That's been over 20 years ago, but it's really something that you don't just leave behind. It's something that you always remember.
And then what was your entree to motion pictures?
Well, I started out, I was medically retired out of the Marine Corps in 1971. And I really couldn't afford to go to college in the States.
So what then was your entree to the motion picture business?
Well, I retired out of the Marine Corps in 1971, and I wanted to go to college, and I had the GI Bill of Rights behind me. But I really couldn't afford to go to college in the States. Very expensive. Cost of living was too high, and I couldn't make it on my retirement in what the GI Bill of Rights would give me to go to school. So I decided to go to college in Manila, in the Philippine Islands. And I went back over and I started college, and it wasn't long before I realized that I couldn't afford to go to college there either. So I started looking around for work. But what happened was I used to go down to the Manila Hotel every morning and have coffee, and it was the Hilton Hotel in Manila. And I used to go over there and have coffee so that I could read the Stars and Stripes newspaper, which was about the only place in Manila that it was available. And I met up with a lot of directors, producers, and local Philippine directors and producers, people that were dealing with the Philippine media. And I struck up friendship with several of these people. Wasn't long before one of them approached me and asked me if I couldn't do commercials, if I would consider doing blue jean commercials for him. As a matter of fact, is what it was. And I, of course, asked him, well, how much does it pay? And I found out that it paid quite well, so naturally, the next thing I knew, I was in front of the camera doing commercials for blue jeans. One thing led to another, and I found myself doing tobacco product commercials and sports equipment commercials. I ended up in several films. I did 3 local Filipino films, and I was getting quite well known in the industry over in the Philippine Islands. And then all of a sudden, here come Apocalypse Now with Francis Ford Coppola. And I went and seen an old friend of mine in Manila, and he's the only American casting director in Manila. And it was Ken Metcalf is his name, and I told him that I would like to get out on the set of Apocalypse Now and see if I couldn't get involved some way. And he worked it out where I went out as a background extra. I struck up a friendship with the technical advisor, and we discussed several parts of the technical aspects of the film. And it came down where Coppola one day was needing a helicopter pilot, somebody to act as a helicopter pilot. So I seemed to have looked like a helicopter pilot to Francis Ford Coppola, and he asked me if I'd be his helicopter pilot. Well, certainly, of course I would. So that was my big start in the American motion picture industry. But as soon as we finished with Apocalypse Now, Sidney J. Fury came over with his band of renegades to do The Boys in Company C. And I walked right off the Apocalypse Now set, and a week later I was doing Sidney's film, The Boys in Company C. I was working out with his actor that he had brought from Hollywood to play the part of his drill instructor, and I was on the sound stage and I was demonstrating how a drill instructor would handle a certain situation. And Sidney Furie and Andre Morgan, the producer of the film, came into the soundstage and watched us as we worked out. And that evening they called me into the office and asked me if I couldn't be their drill instructor. I answered, of course, yes, and I walked out of the office their drill instructor. Sidney liked me well enough where when he did his next Vietnam War film, which was Purple Hearts with Cheryl Ladd and Ken Wall, he called me back again to do another major role, which this time I played the part of an old field Marine, grouchy old gunnery sergeant in Vietnam. And I also did the technical advice for that film. And I did several other films after that that I really wasn't too happy with. They were low-budget fly-by-nighters, real quickly done. And as a matter of fact, one of them, my voice is dubbed, a very high-pitched voice. I don't know how that ever happened, but I didn't care for it, and I just basically don't mention those films. But it wasn't long, then here come Stanley Kubrick called me to do the Full Metal Jacket.
He heard about you through someone else, or?
He's seen me. He's seen me in the Boys and Company C, and he also noticed that I was technical advisor, and he made some inquiries as to how he could get in touch with me, and he got in touch with me, and next thing I knew, I was on my way to England to do a Vietnam War film for Stanley Kubrick. And now I went over there to be the technical advisor for the film, is what it boiled down to. But I had read the novel, The Short Timers by Gustav Hasford, and I spotted a role in there that I would dearly love to do, and that I really felt that I could do well, and that was the part of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. And once I got over to London, I went up to Stanley and I said, look, I think I could do this part real well. How about giving me a shot at it? I'd like to audition. And he told me, well, he had seen me in Boys and Company C, and he says, you're just not mean enough, Lee. You're too nice. And that was very insulting to me, because I've considered myself one of the foulest suckers in the world. I said, I am mean enough, but and I told him, I said, well, Sidney Furie wanted the part played like that, so that was the gravity of the part. And that's the way I played it. But he says, no, I've already got a contract on it. The part's already contracted out. I've got an actor in Hollywood.
Who was the actor?
I really couldn't answer that question. I'm not sure who it was, really. But
you'd rather not, for professional reasons?
Well, I have an idea who it was, but I don't really know for sure. But I don't think it would be really right, even if I did know who it was, to voice it. But anyway, I decided, well, I couldn't just let it lie, because I was really enthusiastic about this part, and I felt that there was no one that could do the part better than I, and so I pursued it further. I interviewed all the background extras, myself and Leon Vitali. Leon Vitali is Stanley Kubrick's right-hand man. And we were in charge of interviewing these folks, and we started with the combat portion of the film, and we filmed backwards. We filmed the combat first, and then we did the boot camp stuff. But along towards the end of the filming, we only had a few scenes left to film in the combat portion, and we were now starting to gear up for the boot camp sequence of the film. We needed new faces, so we needed to make up a platoon of background people for our boot camp. Now, Leon and I discussed it, and rather than interview these people on a one-on-one basis, we could save a lot of time and effort by just getting a group of these people together, maybe 30 or so of these background applicants together, and I would interview those people all in one shot. And what I would do is I would go down to the wardrobe department, I would get a Smokey Bear, and I would put on a uniform, and I would come back and I would greet these people to Parris Island, South Carolina, just as a drill instructor would. And I knew the dialogue for Hartman's dialogue for the first scene of the film, and I would give them that dialogue. Then I would move into the platoon, into the group, and I would address them each individually, as a drill instructor would. And Leon Vitale, in turn, would have his video camera, and he would follow me about through the platoon and film the reaction on the faces of the people as I approached them, and insulted them and dressed them down like a drill instructor would do. Leon, we were just really, I was starting to get warmed up, and Leon ran out of tape in his camera. So anyway, we submitted this to Stanley that evening, and Stanley looked at it, and the next morning he was all smiles when I went out to the set, and he knew what the hell I'd done, you know. He says, I wouldn't let you audition. Well, you found a way to audition anyway, didn't you? And of course I had, but he liked the dialogue, and he enjoyed the dialogue enough to where he had it sent down to the secretary, and she typed it all up. And it was 45 pages of typewritten dialogue. And he asked me if he couldn't integrate some of that dialogue, it was very colorful, into the already existing screenplay, which of course I agreed to. And he asked me if I wouldn't look at scene number 2 and scene number 5 and work on those with Leon and put those on videotape and get it over to him so he could have a look and get a more fair estimate of my ability to play the part of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. We did this, and he liked it, and I got the job. The next thing I knew, I was Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. The easy part was over.
The dialogue then that we hear the drill instructor spouting and everything, then that is a combination of your own made-up dialogue from your own experience as a DI, as well as what the writers put down. Is that correct?
Right. What we did, I worked with Stanley every Sunday. I went over to Stanley's house, and he and I worked very closely together, and we would sit down, and Stanley would explain to me what he expected to get out of a particular scene, and we would discuss the scene, and he would more or less tell me what he would like to see emphasized and what message he wanted to get out of this scene. And then he would push the button on his tape recorder, and I would stand up and do it as a real drill instructor would do it. We would do this 3 or 4 times, and then we would send the tape down and have it typed up, and it would come back up, and Stanley and the writers would take just the best lines out of these 4 or 5 takes and integrate those into the already existing screenplay. We did this with almost every scene. That's where we get the authenticity, the power of each scene. I think we had so much dialogue to choose from that there's no doubt each scene had to be very powerful.
A man I work with is a former Marine, served in Korea, served as a combat photographer with NBC during Vietnam. Went to see this movie, and he said, to tell you that you were absolutely wonderful and authentic, a home run all the way around. There was one part of it that he violently disagreed with, not from your point of view, but just the situation in general. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't want to give away too much, but he says, what happened to the DI would never have happened in the Marine Corps, as he knows the Marine Corps.
Right. I like to think not to. However, back in those days, well, even now, I mean, people are walking into Denny's restaurant with a couple of sidearms and a M16 and wiping out, shooting 10 or 15 people. I think really anything is possible in that situation. We did have, in isolated situations where recruits did commit suicide, the tremendous pressure was on them. This situation that we're up against here is Private Pyle loses his grip on reality. I think in a situation where an individual, a human being, has lost his grip on reality such as that, pretty much anything could happen. It's up to the individual himself, isn't it? And he managed to save a few rounds from the rifle range, and he sure killed me. I would rather not have been killed either, to tell you the truth.
As far as other things, because you were still tech advisor, you had that capacity in this film, were there any things that you were able to talk Stanley Kubrick out of it and you just said, no, I'm tech advisor and no, no, no?
I never had any problem with Stanley. Stanley, when I first went over, he and I had a powwow. We sat down and I explained to him how I felt about the subject matter that we were filming. He looked me straight in the eye and smiled and said, thank you, because that's exactly the way I feel about it. I want it as realistic as possible. What I want to put on film is the most authentically real Vietnam era war story that's ever been put on film. And he told me that he wanted it so borderline documentary. He wanted it that real. He said, I'll take care of the story, you take care and you give me the realism. I want everything as real as you can give it to me. Now, when he hired me, he didn't just hire me as a technical advisor, because I've got a phone book, a big, thick, black book, and I've kept names of all of my old friends from the Vietnam era. I've got a brother that served in Vietnam right along with me in that same area. And whenever I see a situation in our screenplay, I call up my friends and I say, hey, Bob, how would you have handled this situation if it had happened to you up in Phu Bai? Do you know of any situations that are anyway similar to this? How were they handled? I talked to 10 or 15 other Vietnam veterans, and we decide what would be the best way to handle this situation. And I think that works out pretty darn good. That way, it's not my opinion. It's the opinion of other people that had experiences in Vietnam. If I was one place in Vietnam, 10 miles down the road, the same instance or the same situation that cropped up that I'm dealing with here would have been handled completely different than I handled it. It depends on the squad leader or the platoon sergeant or the lieutenant in charge. Everybody has a different way of solving a given situation. You might get 10 different opinions on how they would do it. I would do it this way, another person would do it another way.
They're giving me signals that our time is over. I could sit here the rest of the evening.
Ignore them.
However, that tape just, eventually runs out. I've enjoyed meeting you and talking with you very much, and I almost hesitate to say this, but I shouldn't be surprised if I see you at the Academy Awards. I shouldn't be surprised. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much for having me over.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
People are talking about that they